Michael Hartman's truck bounced along the uneven dirt road as he approached the Hawthorne estate. The late afternoon sky was streaked with bands of orange and purple, but it did little to soften the ominous silhouette looming in the distance. The house came into view, perched at the edge of the forest, like a forgotten relic of some bygone era. Its tall, narrow windows stared out across the landscape like darkened eyes, long blind to the world. Michael tried to shake off the creeping sense of unease that had settled in his gut since the moment Evelyn Blackwell had called him. It was just a house, another rundown property that someone with more money than sense wanted to restore. He'd done this job long enough to know that no house, no matter how derelict, could truly be haunted. It was all just bricks and wood, subject to the wear and tear of time and neglect. People made up stories to explain away creaks in the floorboards or drafts in the halls, but it was always something simple: a broken pipe, a damaged foundation, pests burrowing into the walls. That's what Michael believed. Yet, as he parked his truck in the overgrown driveway and stepped out into the cool autumn air, something felt wrong. The wind carried a strange chill that seemed to cut through his jacket, and the trees surrounding the estate swayed ominously, their branches groaning like ancient bones. He glanced at the house, taking in the sagging roof, the boarded-up windows, and the cracked stone steps leading up to the front door. He had seen worse, but something about this place made his skin prickle. Michael took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was there. He was a professional. Evelyn had hired him to do a thorough inspection before she began the restoration. The house had sat abandoned for years, left to decay and gather dust, and it was his job to figure out just how much damage had been done. He wasn't here to entertain ghost stories. He was here to do a job. Pulling his tool bag from the back of his truck, he made his way toward the front door. As he approached, he noticed the door was slightly ajar, hanging loosely on its rusted hinges. That was odd. He had expected the place to be locked up tight. He hesitated for just a moment before pushing the door open with a soft creak. The sound echoed through the vast empty foyer beyond, bouncing off the high ceilings and disappearing into the shadows. The air inside was stale and thick with dust, and the scent of mildew hung heavy in the air. He stepped inside, feeling the wooden floor creak beneath his weight, and took a quick look around. The house was even more dilapidated than he'd expected. Cobwebs clung to every corner, and the wallpaper peeled away from the walls in long, curling strips. Faded portraits of grim-faced men and women lined the walls, their eyes seemingly watching him as he moved further inside. Michael suppressed a shiver. In the center of the foyer, a grand staircase curved upward, its banister chipped and worn. Dust motes floated lazily in the thin slivers of light, filtering through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. The house was silent except for the faint groaning of the wind outside and the soft creaks of the old floorboards beneath his feet. He pulled out his flashlight and swept the beam across the room. The light caught something on the far wall, a note pinned to the peeling wallpaper with a rusty nail. Michael frowned and moved closer, shining his light on the yellowing paper. "Inspect thoroughly. Check every corner. Don't miss the basement." The handwriting was elegant, almost too neat, and there was no signature. He assumed it was from Evelyn, but something about the wording felt off. Inspect thoroughly? That went without saying. It was his job. And the basement? Why emphasize that? He shrugged the thought away. It didn't matter. The note was probably just Evelyn's way of making sure he did a good job. She seemed the type to be meticulous. Michael pocketed the note and made his way through the house, starting with the ground floor. He moved methodically from room to room, jotting down notes about the condition of the structure and the various repairs that would be needed. Every room had the same unsettling stillness to it, as though the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. In the kitchen, he found an old stove and rusted plumbing that would need to be replaced. In the dining room, the windows had been shattered, their jagged edges framed by rotting wood. The dining table was still there, covered in a thick layer of dust, with the remains of a long-forgotten meal scattered across its surface. Plates and silverware laid out as though someone had simply walked away and never returned. As he worked, Michael couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Every so often, he would glance over his shoulder, expecting to see someone standing in the doorway, but there was never anyone there. It was just his nerves getting the better of him, he told himself. Old houses had a way of playing tricks on the mind. The silence, the shadows, it all fed into the human tendency to imagine things that weren't there. But even as he tried to convince himself of that, the sense of unease only deepened. By the time he made his way to the second floor, the light outside had faded to dusk, and the house had grown colder. The temperature drop was sudden and severe, and Michael found himself shivering as he climbed the stairs. His flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment the entire hallway was plunged into darkness. He slapped the side of the flashlight, cursing under his breath as the light sputtered back to life. He stood at the top of the stairs, staring down the long hallway. The doors to the various rooms were closed, but there was one at the end of the hall that was slightly ajar. A faint light spilled out from the crack, flickering as though from a dying bulb. Michael's heart skipped a beat. He hadn't turned on any lights. As far as he knew, there was no electricity running to the house yet. He took a deep breath and started toward the door. With every step, the whispers of doubt in his mind grew louder. Maybe this wasn't just an ordinary inspection. Maybe there was something else going on here, something he couldn't explain. When he reached the door, he paused. The air was cold, almost frigid now, and his breath puffed out in small clouds before him. Slowly, he pushed the door open and stepped inside. It was a small bedroom, sparsely furnished with a bed, a dresser, and a single chair by the window. The wallpaper here was torn and faded, but there was something else, something that made his skin crawl. A mirror hung on the wall opposite the bed, its surface dusty and cracked. But in the dim light, Michael saw something in the reflection that made his blood run cold. There was a figure standing behind him, barely visible in the shadows, its outline distorted and strange. He spun around, heart hammering in his chest, but the room was empty. The house groaned, its ancient bones creaking as the wind outside howled through the cracks. Michael took a step back, his mind racing to make sense of what he had just seen. He turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. It was just his imagination. It had to be. But deep down, Michael knew something was very, very wrong with this house. Michael stood frozen in the center of the small bedroom, the memory of the shadowy figure in the mirror etched into his mind like a scar. His breath came in short, ragged bursts as he tried to calm his racing heart, but it was no use. The room felt wrong, oppressive, almost suffocating, and no amount of logical reasoning could shake the feeling that something unnatural had just occurred. He forced himself to take a deep breath, trying to push the fear aside. It was just a trick of the light, he told himself. Maybe the cracked mirror had distorted his reflection, and his tired eyes had seen something that wasn't there. It wasn't the first time an old house had played tricks on him. He was exhausted from the long day and spooked by the decaying structure. That had to be it. And yet the cold in the room was undeniable. His breath still fogged before him, and the air felt dense and heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on him. He quickly jotted down some notes just to keep his hands busy, then turned and left the bedroom. The feeling of being watched followed him out into the hallway. As Michael descended the staircase, the house seemed to groan in protest beneath his weight. Each step was a creak, a sigh, as if the very walls of the house were alive and aware of his presence. The dim light from his flashlight wavered, casting long, twisted shadows that seemed to stretch out, grasping at the corners of his vision. He shook off the sensation and continued his inspection, trying to focus on the task at hand. But no matter where he went, that eerie sense of being observed lingered. And then the whispers began. At first, they were barely perceptible, a soft rustling that could have been the wind slipping through the cracked windows. Michael barely registered it, absorbed in his work as he inspected the state of the plumbing in the kitchen. He crouched by the old sink, shining his light into the dark recesses of the cabinetry, when he heard it again. A faint, almost imperceptible sound. Words. Michael straightened slowly, his ears straining to pick up the noise. It was so quiet that it could have been mistaken for the house settling or the distant howl of the wind through the forest outside. But as he stood there holding his breath, the sound grew more distinct. Soft, murmured voices, barely audible but undeniably human. He swept his flashlight across the kitchen, scanning every corner, but there was nothing there. The whispers faded, retreating back into the silence of the old house, and Michael exhaled shakily. His nerves were getting the better of him, he reasoned. It had been a long day, and he was jumpy. But as he moved on to the dining room, the whispers returned. This time they were closer, just on the edge of his hearing. They drifted around him like voices carried on a breeze, too low to make out clearly but unmistakably there. Michael stopped dead in his tracks, his skin crawling. He turned slowly, his flashlight illuminating the dining room in pale, wavering light. The room was empty, just as it had been when he'd first walked through it. The air was still. The house was still. But the whispers, they were persistent. "Hello?" he called out, the sound of his voice strange and hollow in the emptiness of the house. The whispers ceased immediately, leaving behind a ringing silence that made his ears throb. He waited, his muscles tense, but no one answered. He swallowed hard and shook his head, feeling foolish for calling out into an empty house. No one was here. It was an old house, probably just the wind getting through the walls, he thought again, trying to steady his nerves. He wasn't about to let some creaks and whispers spook him into abandoning the job. Evelyn was paying good money for this inspection, and he wasn't going to let some old house get under his skin. But as he moved through the house, room by room, the whispers continued. They seemed to follow him, always just beyond the range of understanding, like fragments of conversations that had been cut off mid-sentence. The voices were low and indistinct, but sometimes he thought he caught a word, just a single syllable that sent a shiver down his spine. He could never quite make out what they were saying, but they were there, and the whispers weren't alone. As Michael moved through the house, he began to catch glimpses of movement out of the corner of his eye, shadows darting just at the edge of his vision, quick and fleeting. He would turn, expecting to find something, a rat maybe, or a branch tapping against the window, but there was nothing, only the empty rooms, the silent walls, and the suffocating darkness. It was as though the house itself was alive, its very essence seeping into his mind, twisting his thoughts. The once strong walls felt brittle now, like they were held together by the weight of secrets buried deep in the past. He couldn't shake the sense that something or someone was hiding just behind the crumbling plaster, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. Michael's flashlight flickered again, and he cursed under his breath, giving it a sharp tap. The light flared back to life, casting sharp, angular shadows against the walls. He had been through enough old houses to know that bad wiring and faulty fixtures were par for the course, but tonight every flicker, every shadow seemed more sinister. He forced himself to keep moving, but the house resisted his presence at every turn. The whispers grew louder, though still unintelligible, and with them came a mounting sense of dread. Each time he stepped into a new room, the walls seemed to close in on him, as if the house were shrinking around him, forcing him deeper into its bowels. Finally, he reached the basement door. It loomed before him like the mouth of a cave, yawning open, waiting. Michael stood there for a moment, staring at the door, feeling a cold sweat break out across his skin. The whispers were louder now, swirling around him in a cacophony of voices that seemed to be urging him forward, beckoning him to descend into the depths. He didn't want to go down there. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to turn back, to leave the house, to run. But the note Evelyn had left flashed through his mind. Don't miss the basement. With a deep breath, Michael grasped the door handle and pulled it open. The hinges groaned in protest, and the air that wafted up from the basement was even colder than the rest of the house, damp and musty, with a faint, almost metallic tang that made his stomach churn. The stairs leading down were narrow and steep, barely wide enough for him to walk comfortably. His flashlight beam barely pierced the darkness below, and the whispers seemed to swell as he took his first step down. They weren't faint anymore. They were all around him now, surrounding him, enveloping him. Keep going, they seemed to say. Don't stop. Come closer. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he descended, each step feeling heavier than the last. The cold seeped into his bones, and the oppressive air made it hard to breathe. He could feel the weight of the house pressing down on him from above, as if it were watching his every move. When he finally reached the bottom of the stairs, he found himself in a large open space. The basement was unfinished, with rough stone walls and a dirt floor. His flashlight swept across the room, illuminating old wooden beams and rusted metal piping that crisscrossed overhead. The air was thick with the scent of decay. But there was something else down here, too. Something that didn't belong. In the far corner of the basement, partially hidden by shadows, was a small padlocked door. It was old and worn, its surface covered in layers of dust and grime. But the lock was new, gleaming silver against the dull wood. Michael frowned. This door hadn't been on the blueprints Evelyn had given him. The whispers surged again, louder now, almost frantic. They were no longer just background noise. They were a constant presence, hissing and murmuring in his ears, urging him to open the door. Michael hesitated. Every instinct told him to leave, to get out of this house before something happened that he couldn't explain, couldn't undo. But he couldn't ignore the door, couldn't ignore the way the whispers seemed to converge on it, as though everything in the house had led him here. His hands trembled as he reached for his crowbar. The lock snapped open easily, and the door creaked as it swung inward, revealing a narrow stairwell that led even deeper into the earth. Michael's breath caught in his throat. He had a sinking feeling that whatever waited for him down there wasn't something he was meant to find. The stairwell stretched into a void of darkness, the steps worn and slick beneath Michael's boots. He hesitated at the top, staring into the abyss below, gripping the doorframe as though it might pull him back into safety. The whispers, now almost a constant hum in his ears, grew louder, insistent and demanding, their incomprehensible words coiling around his thoughts like tendrils of smoke. The air was heavier here, thick with a smell that reminded him of damp earth and something else, something metallic, like blood. Michael steeled himself, his knuckles white as he gripped his flashlight tighter. He could feel it now, pressing against the edges of his mind. A presence that didn't belong in this world, waiting for him at the bottom of those steps. It felt ancient and restless, a hunger that had been left unsatisfied for far too long. But something else pushed him forward, something darker, buried deep within him. It wasn't just curiosity or stubbornness. No, it was the whispers. They wanted him to come. The wooden stairs creaked beneath his weight as he descended into the depths of the house, each step echoing in the hollow space below. The walls around him were rough stone, cold and slick to the touch, and the further he went, the colder it became. The light from his flashlight barely penetrated the darkness, casting weak beams across the stone walls and uneven steps. He wasn't sure how long he had been descending. Time seemed to warp here, stretching and distorting, until it felt as though he had been walking for hours. But finally, the stairwell opened into a small underground chamber, carved out of the earth itself. His flashlight flickered, sputtering in the damp air before settling into a weak but steady beam. Michael stepped off the final stair and into the chamber. The whispers were deafening now, so loud that they felt as if they were inside his skull, hammering against the walls of his mind. He tried to block them out, but it was no use. They had a rhythm now, a cadence, their voices twining together like a dark chant that he couldn't escape. He swept the flashlight across the chamber. It was small, no more than 20 feet across, with low, arched ceilings that barely cleared his head. The stone walls were covered in strange markings, symbols and sigils that looked ancient, etched deep into the rock. Some were familiar, others entirely alien, but they all gave off a feeling of wrongness, like they didn't belong in this world. And there, in the center of the room, was the altar. It was crude, made of dark stone and covered in dust and debris, but there was something unmistakably sinister about it. The top of the altar was carved with more symbols, and resting on it was an old, leather-bound book. Its cover was cracked and worn, the leather darkened with age, or perhaps something else. Michael didn't want to think about it. Surrounding the altar were dozens of photographs, their edges curling with age, yellowed and brittle. He recognized them instantly. They were the same faces from the portraits upstairs. But there was something more. In each of the photographs behind the figures was a dark shape, a shadowy figure barely visible but unmistakably present. It loomed over them, distorted and monstrous, and no matter how he tried to focus on it, its shape never fully resolved. It was as if the figure was shifting, its form never quite settling into something Michael could comprehend. Michael's heart raced as he knelt to pick up one of the photos, his hand trembling. The figure seemed to pulse with malevolence, even in the still image, and the air around him thickened as though it were alive. He knew instinctively that this shadow, this thing was connected to the whispers, to the house itself. He felt its presence all around him, watching, waiting. Against his better judgment, Michael reached for the book on the altar. As his fingers brushed the cracked leather, a sudden wave of nausea washed over him. The whispers surged in his ears, their chanting more frantic now, more desperate. It was as if the house was pleading with him, begging him not to open the book. But something inside him, a compulsion he couldn't explain, drove him to ignore the warning. He flipped open the cover, revealing pages covered in symbols and drawings, each one more grotesque than the last. They depicted strange, twisted figures, creatures with too many limbs and faces that seemed to melt and shift on the page. There were rituals described in languages he couldn't understand, words that twisted his tongue even as he read them silently in his mind. But one drawing stopped him cold. It was the house. The Hawthorne estate was sketched in painstaking detail, its windows dark and empty, its roof sagging under the weight of time. But beneath the house, drawn in darker ink, was something else, something buried deep beneath the foundation. It was a figure, chained and bound, its limbs twisted at unnatural angles. Its face was blank, a featureless expanse that seemed to stare back at him from the page. Michael's breath caught in his throat. His fingers traced the drawing, his mind racing to make sense of it. Was this place a prison? Was this house built to contain whatever this thing was? He couldn't shake the feeling that the figure in the drawing was the same presence he had felt since he first stepped into the house, the same shadow he had glimpsed in the photographs and in the mirror upstairs. Suddenly, the whisper stopped. The silence that followed was worse. It was a suffocating, absolute silence, as though the house itself had taken a deep breath and was holding it, waiting. Michael felt the hair on the back of his neck stand on end. He slowly rose to his feet, his pulse pounding in his ears, his gaze fixed on the altar. Something had changed. The air in the chamber grew colder still, and in the dim light of his flashlight, Michael saw it, a shadow shifting in the far corner of the room. It was barely more than a ripple in the darkness, but it moved with purpose, sliding along the stone walls like a living thing. It grew larger, its form elongating and distorting until it stood as tall as the chamber would allow. Michael's hand tightened around the flashlight as the shadow stepped into the light. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs too long, its body too thin. It had no face, just a smooth, featureless surface where eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. And yet, Michael could feel its gaze as though it were staring straight through him, piercing him to his core. The room seemed to warp around the creature, the stone walls bending inward, closing in. Michael stumbled backward, his breath coming in shallow gasps as he tried to get away from the thing. But the chamber was small, and there was nowhere to run. The figure stepped closer, its movements slow and deliberate, as if savoring the moment. The whispers returned, not from the walls, but from inside his own mind, twisting, spiraling, feeding on his fear. The light from his flashlight flickered, then died, plunging the chamber into complete darkness. Michael's heart raced as he fumbled with the flashlight, desperate to get it working again. But even in the darkness, he could feel the presence of the thing closing in on him, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing second. He could hear the faint sound of breathing, labored and uneven, though he wasn't sure if it was his own or the creature's. And then, without warning, the ground beneath him shifted. It was as if the very earth was moving, rising up to meet him. Michael staggered, his foot catching on something slick, and he fell hard to the floor. His hand scraped against the stone, and he felt something wet and sticky beneath his fingers. He shone the dim light of his failing flashlight on his hand and saw it, dark, glistening blood smeared across his palm. Panicked, he scrambled to his feet, but the figure was there, blocking his path. Its presence filled the chamber, its form towering over him. The air was thick with the scent of decay and rot, and Michael's stomach twisted in revulsion. He had to get out. He had to escape. But the walls seemed to close in, the chamber shrinking around him, trapping him with the creature. The whispers filled his mind now, drowning out all rational thought. They weren't just words, they were feelings, emotions, memories that weren't his own. They overwhelmed him, suffocated him, until he couldn't tell where his thoughts ended and the house's influence began. With one final burst of adrenaline, Michael broke free from the creature's shadow and bolted for the stairs. He didn't look back. He couldn't. His feet pounded against the stone steps as he raced upward, the darkness closing in behind him like a wave. The whispers followed, growing louder, more frantic, as if the house itself was angry that he was leaving. When he finally burst through the door at the top of the stairwell, slamming it shut behind him, the silence was deafening. Michael leaned against the basement door, gasping for air as the heavy wood pressed against his back. His heart thundered in his chest, each beat reverberating in his skull like the pounding of a drum. The silence on the other side of the door was unbearable. He wanted to believe he was safe now, that the house had let him go, but deep down he knew better. The house wasn't done with him yet. The whispers had followed him all the way up the stairs, echoing in his mind like a relentless chorus. Even now they lingered in the back of his thoughts, soft but insistent, threading themselves through his every breath. The cold that had permeated the air in the chamber below had clung to him, a biting chill that refused to release its grip. He pushed himself off the door and stumbled down the hallway, his legs trembling beneath him. The house felt different now, quieter, yes, but there was something more. The shadows seemed to pulse with life, as though they had taken on a will of their own, stretching out along the walls and ceiling in grotesque shapes. The air was heavy with a sense of expectation, and every creak, every groan of the old wood beneath his feet felt purposeful, like the house was guiding him somewhere. Michael's vision swam, the edges of his consciousness fraying as exhaustion and terror warred for control. He needed to get out. He needed to leave this place behind before it consumed him entirely. He stumbled toward the front door, his eyes fixed on the sliver of moonlight spilling in through the cracks between the boards covering the windows. The outside world seemed so far away now, as though it belonged to another life entirely. His fingers closed around the cold brass of the front door handle, and for a moment, his heart lifted. Freedom. He was so close. He turned the knob, but the door wouldn't budge. He rattled it violently, throwing his weight against it, but it remained firmly shut, as though some invisible force was holding it closed. "No," he whispered, panic creeping into his voice. "No, no, no." He pulled at the door with every ounce of strength he had left, but it was no use. The house wouldn't let him go. Despair washed over him and he staggered back, his hands shaking as he stared at the immovable door. The whispers began to rise again, louder now, filling the house with their sinister chant. They seemed almost gleeful, as though the house had been toying with him all along, letting him believe he could escape only to snatch it away at the last moment. He He turned, his back pressed against the door, his eyes scanning the hallway for another way out. But the shadows had deepened, thickened, swirling around him like a living thing. They crawled along the floor, slithering toward him with slow, deliberate purpose. And in those shadows he could see them, figures, tall and gaunt, their faces blank and featureless like the creature from the basement. They moved closer, their limbs too long, too thin, their presence pressing in on him from every side. "Stop!" Michael shouted, but the figures didn't slow. The whispers swelled, almost deafening now, as if they were coming from the figures themselves. The shadows twisted and writhed around their forms, distorting them until they were nothing more than dark blurs, impossible to define but unmistakably menacing. His thoughts were unraveling. Panic clawed at his mind, pulling him deeper into the grip of the house. He could feel it, its ancient will wrapping itself around him, digging its claws into his psyche. The house didn't want to kill him. No, it wanted something far worse. It wanted him to surrender, to belong to it, just like the others before him. He remembered the photographs, the faces of the people who had lived here long ago, those cold, unsmiling faces staring out from faded prints. They had been consumed by the house, trapped within its walls for eternity. And now it was his turn. The basement. The thought came unbidden, a sharp intrusion into his terror. The basement had been more than just a chamber. It had been a prison for whatever that thing was. The house wasn't just a place, it was a vessel, a living, breathing thing designed to contain something ancient and malevolent, something that had reached out to him through the whispers. But maybe, just maybe, if he could seal it again. His body moved on instinct, driven by a single desperate hope. He turned away from the front door and bolted down the hallway, back toward the basement stairs. The air seemed to grow thicker with every step, the walls closing in on him, the house resisting his movement as though it were trying to hold him back. But Michael pushed forward, adrenaline coursing through his veins, his mind fixed on the only plan he had left. The basement door swung open with a deafening creak, revealing the dark stairwell below. The cold hit him like a physical blow, seeping into his bones, but he forced himself to keep moving. His flashlight had long since died, but the faint glow of the moonlight through the boarded windows provided just enough light to guide his steps. Michael's breath came in ragged gasps as he approached the altar, his mind racing for a solution. He grabbed the book, flipping through its pages, searching for something, anything that could help him. The symbols and drawings blurred before his eyes, their meanings lost to him in his frantic state. And then, there it was, a page near the end of the book marked with a symbol that matched the one carved into the altar. The text beneath the symbol was written in a language he couldn't understand, but he knew that this was it. This was the key. The whispers swirled around him, rising to a deafening crescendo, as though the house was trying to drown out his thoughts. The shadows pressed in, the figures looming closer, their faceless heads turned toward him, watching, waiting. Michael placed his hand on the symbol carved into the altar, his fingers trembling. He wasn't sure what would happen next. He wasn't even sure if this would work, but he had no other choice. He began to speak, his voice low and uncertain, trying to mimic the strange words written in the book. The sounds felt foreign on his tongue, harsh and guttural, but he forced himself to keep going. As the last word left his lips, the air around him seemed to shift. The shadows recoiled, pulling back toward the walls, and the figures paused, their movements stuttering as though something had interrupted their advance. For a moment, everything was still. And then, with a sudden rush of force, the room exploded with sound. The whispers turned into screams, terrified, desperate screams that echoed through the chamber. The air vibrated with energy, and Michael felt a surge of power radiating from the altar, pushing against him like a tidal wave. The figures in the shadows began to dissolve, their forms unraveling like smoke caught in a gust of wind. The darkness around him thinned, and Michael felt the oppressive weight of the house begin to lift. The presence that had been pressing against his mind retreated, pulled back into the depths of the house where it belonged. It was working, but then, just as quickly as it had begun, the power receded. The screams faded, replaced by an eerie, unnatural silence. The shadows still clung to the walls, no longer animated but still present, like stains that couldn't be scrubbed away. The air grew cold again, colder than before, and Michael's heart sank. The house wasn't done. The whispers returned, faint at first, but growing louder with each passing second. Michael's breath caught in his throat as he realized his mistake. He hadn't sealed it. He had awakened it. Whatever force he had tried to contain was no longer just a passive presence. It was awake now, fully aware of him, and it was angry. The walls began to shake, the very foundation of the house trembling as though the earth itself were quaking beneath him. The shadows twisted and writhed, forming into something new, something darker. And in that moment, Michael understood. There was no escape. The house would never let him go. Not truly. Michael's legs buckled beneath him as the realization washed over him. The weight of it was too much to bear. He had come so close to breaking free. But the house had always been one step ahead. It had been toying with him, leading him down this path, knowing all along that he would never truly leave. And now, as the darkness closed in, Michael felt a strange sense of acceptance settle over him. He had fought, he had run, but in the end the house had won. He could feel it now, seeping into his mind, wrapping around his thoughts like a shroud. The whispers grew softer, more soothing, as though the house were comforting him, lulling him into submission. His body relaxed and he let out a slow, shuddering breath. The fear that had gripped him for so long melted away, replaced by a strange calm. The house was no longer his enemy. It was a part of him now, and he was a part of it. He had no choice but to embrace it. As the last of the light faded from the room, Michael closed his eyes. The whispers were no longer voices in the walls. They were inside him now, filling the empty spaces of his mind, their presence warm and comforting. And in the silence that followed, the house breathed a long, satisfied sigh. The door upstairs clicked open, but no one was there to walk through it.